Hi, this is Dan Hickey. I'm coming to you today from my office at Indiana University in the Wright School of Education. This is the third in a series of short videos about the practices, principles, and policies that make up the discipline of educational assessment. These videos are intended to help educators, researchers, administrators, and others improve their assessment practices. This will make better use of precious instructional time, improve student outcomes, and lead to better instructional decisions. Today's video concerns the common constructed response formats. Today I'll talk about using them to assess course knowledge in classroom or online contexts. This video will help you create the two most commonly used types of constructed response formats. These are short answer and essay items. Essay items sometimes are referred to as extended response formats. There's a bit of a range between the two, but there are clear and important differences between them. As the label implies, this item format literally requires the test taker to construct a response to an assessment prompt. This means that they require the individual at minimum to recall some information. Generally speaking, this means that constructed response formats require deeper processing than selected response formats that can only require the recognition of a correct response. But this does not mean that constructed response items automatically get at deeper levels of understanding. In particular, short answer items that ask learners to recall specific factual and procedural knowledge can wildly overstate how much students know. This is particularly the case when those same facts and skills are directly presented in course contexts. This can also be a problem with essay items when students are given the exact same essay prompt in class as on their exams. Likewise, excessively training students to write the familiar 5-paragraph essay and then asking them to do the same in an assessment context, even with a different prompt, can really seriously overstate students' actual writing ability. Furthermore, doing so teaches students that expert writing is all about knowledge telling. In fact, expert writers use the act of writing to learn more about a topic, what cognitive scientists call knowledge construction. Really good constructed response items actually do really require the students to construct some understanding. First, let's start with the benefits and drawbacks of both types of items. The benefits come from the fact that the test takers must produce or construct or somehow come up with some sort of an answer. Again, they're not recognizing. Generally speaking, this elicits higher order skills. This directly leads to the drawbacks of these items, though. Constructed response items take longer to score and are more difficult to grade because of the wide variation in answers and how they might be worded. This becomes more of a problem as answers get longer. In turn, this makes constructed response items generally less reliable and consistent than selected response formats. This introduces more random variation in the scores. That becomes a bigger issue as the stakes get higher. Finally, in my experience, constructed response items can provide misleading evidence that can both overstate and understate what students know. Let's start with the 5 general item writing guidelines that I included on my prior video on selected response items. These guidelines take on somewhat different meaning and relevance when applied to constructed response formats. Probably the most relevant guideline for many of you, and certainly for me, is not providing unintentional clues. This is one way that constructed response items can overestimate student knowledge. Conversely, you want to avoid ambiguous statements and provide clear instructions. Ambiguity and lack of clarity lead constructed response items to often underestimate how much students know and can do. Finally, use appropriate syntax and vocabulary. Let's first consider short answer items. Short answer items ask for a word, a phrase, or a sentence. If you're getting into paragraphs, you're really getting into the realm of essay items. Here are 2 examples of short answer items I might use for a lesson in my own course on the topic I'm talking to you about today. The first uses what's known as the completion format, while the second uses the direct question version. Take a minute to read each, and then write down your answer based on the previous slide. Both of these are good examples of the advantages and disadvantages of constructed response formats. Both of these items would be significantly easier if they were turned into multiple choice items. Most of you probably were able to provide the correct answer for the first item, that is recalled. Now, if I were to take that item and to turn it into a multiple choice item with the responses recognize, recall, and construct as the responses, Many knowledgeable adults could easily infer that recognition is easier than recall, and they would recognize that the FOIL constructed would be relatively redundant. Now let's consider the second item. I would accept both less reliable and more variability as correct responses. But what about if the student says they are more misleading? What I'm getting at here is you have to really think hard about what responses you're going to accept in constructed response. Notice that I was clear on my previous slide that these formats may be misleading. Then in the actual item, I highlighted the word major. As such, I could confidently and fairly assume that a student who provided the answer, they are more misleading, knows less than the student who answers more variable or less reliable. This is an example of how instruction and assessment can and should work together. The preceding might have been a little hard to follow. If it wasn't, it's because you already know a lot about assessment, or you're really not paying attention. Let's take a few seconds and review some of the guidelines for short answer items and unpack how to avoid these kinds of problems. These are 5 widely used guidelines for writing good short answer items. These are drawn from Jim Popham's textbook, but there are many others out there that are quite similar to these guidelines. These will help you avoid many common problems, but you're going to need to revisit them repeatedly as you construct and, most importantly, revise your assessments as you go. For me, the most relevant guideline is nurturing concise responses. I always get this one wrong. Consider my first example. I was really looking for one specific word, recalled. I had to do some wordsmithing and elected to use the incomplete sentence format to be sure that students who learned about recall did not still give the less accurate term construct as a response to that item. My second most relevant guideline is that direct answer question formats are generally preferable. This is less relevant for me because my students are adults, but this is a big problem for young children. You'll usually find that writing direct questions also forces you to think more deeply about what you're asking about and often will eliminate some of the ambiguity that can be so problematic in this item format. The third guideline is that blanks should be equal length. Popham calls this linear equality. I deliberately violated this rule in my examples because I wanted to show you the complex balancing act that goes into making items that can be scored reliably while also yielding valid evidence of student knowledge. On one hand, I wanted to nurture a concise response in the first example, but in varying the lengths, I gave away some information about what I was actually looking for. That's okay for my example, but generally speaking, you want to avoid doing that in your own assessments. This leads to the fourth guideline. If you do use incomplete statements, never put the blanks at the beginning of the items. It makes for a very difficult item and it's confusing, particularly for younger learners, but generally it should be avoided. The best format is to have equal length blanks lined up on the right side of the page. This will make them a lot easier to score with a scoring key. Finally, if you are using incomplete statements, use just 1 or 2 blanks. You really don't want to go beyond 3. One common exception to this is the widely used close format, where numerous words are removed from a passage to assess comprehension. Now let's consider essay item formats. Essay items are very popular with educators. They're widely used to assess more complex course knowledge and student writing ability. In composition classes, teachers often ask for writing samples that function pretty much in the same way. I'm not talking about long-term papers here. We're talking about on-demand, asking students to sit and demonstrate their ability to write or their knowledge about something in a structured on-demand setting. First, let's talk about the benefits and drawbacks of essay item formats. The benefits are twofold. They're really good at assessing more complex learning outcomes, and they're an excellent way to see how students compose an original answer, in other words, their writing ability. This also leads to the drawbacks. They're a lot harder than most people realize to create. Most instructors have experienced the frustrating challenge of trying to score essays fairly and reliably without spending your entire weekend doing so. Nonetheless, even well-made essay items are time-consuming to score. This makes them problematic when the stakes are high. Some of you might have teaching assistants to help you with this. Don't let them do it all because you'll learn a lot of useful nuances from scoring essays. Essay items are also time-consuming for students to complete. This means that you can only sample a small amount of what students might have learned unless you plan to take up a great deal of class time. Regardless, during the exam time, some students may demand a great deal of time, and this can create additional problems with kids who are finished with free time. I'll return to that issue. Finally, essay items can also be misleading. Of course, all assessments can be misleading. Compared to short answer items, essay items can allow more experienced writers to appear more knowledgeable about a topic than they really are, while making less experienced writers, or writers who are not working in their first language, look less knowledgeable. The real issue here is that essay formats conflate disciplinary knowledge with writing ability. This can be a bigger issue in some contexts than in others. For instance, when I teach assessment, I want students to learn concepts like the ones I'm talking about today in a way that allow them to succeed in network professional contexts where writing is actually pretty important. But on the other hand, I have students in my course who are taking the course in their second language, so if I relied a lot on essay items in my language, in English, that really doesn't say how well students or how much students might know about that topic if they were writing in their native language. In fact, I don't use essay items at all in my classroom assessment course, but I use them exclusively in my doctoral seminars as a complement to research papers and to help prepare my students for their grueling qualifying examinations. Here are 2 example essay items that I might use for the topic of this video. Take a minute and read them and consider your response. You might even want to pause the video and take a few minutes to write down a response. Now let's use my examples to consider the guidelines for effective essay items. Most of the general guidelines and the guidelines for the short answer items also apply to essay items, but Popham and other experts have identified specific guidelines for the unique challenges of essay items. The most relevant guideline for me is the one I almost never follow and end up regretting doing so. At minimum, you should try to get into the heads of the learners and imagine how they will respond. Better yet, get a few students or a knowledgeable colleague to complete an item and try to score it. At minimum, you should write out an expected answer yourself and try to score it. Most of us always seem to be pressed for time when we're creating exams. We're often doing it at the very last minute. A few minutes can save hours of aggravation trying to score poorly constructed essay items. For me, the second most relevant guideline is avoiding optional items. Before I started teaching this class, I used to do this all the time, but then I came to realize that it really makes the assessment a lot easier to complete. But more problematically, it really encourages students to skip concepts while they're learning that they're struggling to understand in the hopes that they'll be able to skip that particular concept on the assessment. So just don't do it. Plus, it introduces a lot of variability in student scores. Because of their open-ended nature, it's paramount that you provide clear guidelines on essay items. One thing that I often overlook is the need to be explicit about what to write. Notice in my first example I said 2 advantages and 2 disadvantages, and not just the advantages. I also said state and describe instead of just described. If I had said just described, some students might have given one-word response, so I make it clear to the student I want them to state what it is and then give a description of that. You want to clearly describe how much you want students to write. You may have noticed on my second item I said a paragraph. That's a really helpful guideline. You don't want one student writing a paragraph and another student writing a page. You also want to be clear on how much time you want students to spend. If you're clear about how much you want students to write and what they're expected to write about, the time shouldn't be an issue. Finally, you should clearly indicate the relative value of the items. This is true for all items, but it's particularly the case with essay items. Let's talk about this in the context of essay scoring guidelines. Essay items are sufficiently complex that they call for a separate set of guidelines on scoring them. Here's another take on Jim Popham's guidelines for doing so. There are similar ones out there on the internet. As with the guideline for creating essay items, the most important guideline is the ones that most of us often violate. You'll save yourself a lot of time and headaches if you think about scoring and make your rubric before you have your students complete the essays. Better still, give it to a student or a friend to complete the essay and try to score it. Creating the rubric and scoring practice items will often lead you to further refine the essay items. That's going to save you a lot of time and might give you back some of your weekend. Second, when scoring essay items, give some thought to what matters. Do you care about grammar and mechanics? If you're writing in a composition setting, that certainly is going to matter, but it might not matter as much if you're using essay items to get at complex disciplinary knowledge. Third, you want to score one essay item at a time so that you can compare answers clearly across students. Again, classroom assessments are one time where you really don't want to be trying to save paper. For longer essay items, one answer per page is often appropriate. If you're teaching online, many learning management systems and online testing facilities have features and settings that will help you do this. Fourth, try to evaluate anonymously. Researchers have shown over and over again that most teachers can be remarkably biased against some students and in favor of others without ever recognizing it. There are a number of strategies for anonymizing. For example, some teachers will have students write their name on the back of the essay page, or if you're using a blue book or a composition book, have students put their name on the very last page of it and just don't look at it. Many learning management systems and online testing facilities have features that will help you do this. The fifth essay scoring guideline is choosing between holistic or analytic scoring keys. Now, I put this last, but it's actually one of the most important points. Holistic grading is when you give a grade or a score for the entire essay. It's quicker, but the problem is that it's often quite imprecise and it doesn't provide as much useful feedback. Analytic grading is when you assign a certain number of points for various categories of the essay or composition, such as organization, clarity, content, etc. This generally focuses useful attention of both the teacher and the student on specific aspects of the essay, but don't get carried away with overly detailed scoring keys that keep both teachers and students from seeing the big picture. One of the many great ideas that I took away from Jim Popham's textbook from teaching my assessment class is that first score all of your essay items holistically, and then go back and the ones that are seriously deficient score with the analytic rubric. You don't want to spend huge amounts of your time splitting hairs over a few points on an otherwise complete essay. Again, this matters. If you're a writing and composition instructor, that's going to be different than if you're using essay items to get at complex course knowledge and where you're not as concerned with writing. In general, I want to encourage you to save your energy and your patience and your time for student interaction when your feedback can be used formatively. When you're using essay items as a summative assessment of prior learning, it's not really a good use of your time to spend a whole bunch of time splitting hairs. Students actually really won't want to discuss it. They're going to want to argue with you about points and things like that. That's all for now about constructed response items. If you're watching this video, it probably means that you have to create and score constructed response assessments for students and probably score them too. I want to encourage you to use these and other guidelines all the time as you do. Go back and revisit them. As you saw in this video, there's a lot of trade-offs when constructing and scoring these sorts of items. Essay items in particular can be incredibly time-consuming for both instructors and students, and that takes away from instructional time, so do it well. And remember, once you're assigning summative grades to assessments, their formative value for students is generally limited. Students are going to want to focus on points, unclear instructions, and that doesn't really help them learn. Just be careful. Don't spend too much time letting students revise answers or devoting entire class periods to discussing and debating answers. In my opinion, it's really just not a very good use of class time to go over and over assessments. Just be done with it. Save that class time for more formative purposes. Again, this is Dan Hickey from Indiana University. I hope you find these guidelines useful. I want to encourage you to consider these item formats, but I really want to encourage you to get your hands on some guidelines. You want to look them up on the internet. You may want to get a copy of Jim Popham's textbook and go back and revisit the guidelines. They will make more and more sense as you go over and over your items. Think about it each time you make the items. This is a really important use of instructional time and you want to do it well. Thank you very much.